The carriage wheels stopped outside the great stone house, and Eleanor Ashworth felt her stomach twist before she even saw his face. She pressed her palm flat against her middle, steadying herself, though nothing could steady the fear rising in her chest. Nathaniel had sent no letter warning her of his return. He never did anymore. She watched from the window as he stepped down, his coat dark against the pale morning light, his jaw set in the same hard line she had learned to dread over the past year. She smoothed her skirts and walked to the top of the stairs, forcing her spine straight, her chin level. Whatever he had come to say, she would not let him see her tremble. The front doors opened, and cold air rushed in ahead of him. He did not smile. He never smiled at her these days. He removed his gloves finger by finger, his eyes finding hers across the wide entrance hall, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Eleanor," he said, his voice even, controlled, the voice he used for business matters and difficult tenants. "We need to speak, privately." She descended the stairs slowly, her hand gliding along the banister, buying herself seconds she did not have. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I ring for tea?" "No tea." He turned toward the study without waiting for her answer, already certain she would follow. He always assumed she would follow. She always did. Inside the study, he closed the door and stood by the cold hearth, his back to her, his shoulders squared like a man preparing for battle rather than a conversation with his own wife. Eleanor folded her hands in front of her, hiding the slight curve beneath her gown that no one yet knew existed. Not the housekeeper, not her own sister, only her lady's maid, Margaret, who had sworn her silence weeks ago in this very house. "I have spoken with my solicitor," Nathaniel began, still facing away from her. "The papers are being drawn. I intend to end this marriage, Eleanor. Formally. Completely." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward until her whole body felt the shock of them. She had known this day might come. She had feared it every night since he left for London 3 months ago, leaving her with nothing but a cold farewell and a house too large for her loneliness. But hearing it spoken aloud, in his flat, deliberate voice, was different from fearing it in the dark. "I see," she said, because she could think of nothing else to say that would not betray the tremor building in her throat. He finally turned to look at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or simple discomfort at watching a woman absorb a blow he had chosen to deliver without warning. "This marriage was never meant to be more than an arrangement," he said. "You know this as well as I do. Our families wished it. Duty required it. But there has never been affection between us, Eleanor. Only obligation. I see no reason to continue pretending otherwise." She wanted to laugh, though nothing about this was funny. There had been affection, she thought. There had been evenings by the fire when he read to her from books he pretended not to enjoy, and mornings when he brought her flowers from the garden without being asked, and one night during her father's illness when he had sat beside her for 6 hours without a single word, simply because she could not bear to be alone. He remembered none of it, or pretended not to. Perhaps to him, none of it had meant what she believed it meant. "When do you intend for this to be finalized?" she asked, keeping her voice steady through sheer will. "Within the month. I have already begun making arrangements for your settlement." "You will want for nothing, Eleanor. I intend to be fair. Fair, as though a marriage could be measured and divided like an estate's accounts." She studied his face, searching for some crack in his composure, some sign that this decision cost him anything at all. She found only the same tired resolve he had worn since he returned from his father's funeral 2 years ago, a man who had learned to carry duty like armor and had forgotten how to remove it. "Is there someone else?" The question left her before she could stop it, sharper than she intended. His expression hardened. "This has nothing to do with anyone else. This is about ending an arrangement that serves neither of us," she almost told him then. The words rose in her throat, ready to spill out. "I am carrying your child." But something stopped her, some old stubborn pride that refused to let him think she was using a child to hold him against his will. If he wished to leave a marriage built on obligation, she would not chain him to her with a different kind of obligation. She would not become one more duty he resented. "Very well," she said instead, and the words tasted like ash. "I will not fight you on this, Nathaniel." Something shifted in his eyes at her use of his given name, something almost like surprise, as though he had expected resistance and did not know what to do with her calm acceptance instead. But he said nothing further. He only nodded once, sharp and final, and turned back toward the window, dismissing her without a word. Eleanor left the study with her head high and her hands trembling at her sides, and only when she reached the privacy of her own chamber did she allow the tears to fall. Margaret found her there an hour later, curled on the window seat, staring out at the gray gardens below. "He has decided to end things," Eleanor said before Margaret could ask. "The papers are already being prepared." Margaret's face fell. She had served Eleanor since before the marriage, had watched the whole arrangement unfold from its cold beginning, had hoped, as Eleanor once had, that something warmer might grow between two people forced together by their families' ambitions. "You must tell him about the child, my lady. He has a right to know." "He has a right to leave without being trapped," Eleanor said, pressing her hand once more to her stomach. "I will not use this baby as a chain around his neck, Margaret. If he wishes to be free of me, he will be free. The child and I will manage. And if he learns of it later, from someone else? What then?" Eleanor had no answer for that. She only shook her head and turned back to the window, watching the gray clouds roll over the hills beyond the estate, wondering how a marriage that had once held small, quiet moments of warmth had come to this cold, final ending. She thought of the night before her father's illness worsened, when Nathaniel had held her hand without being asked. She thought of the morning he had laughed, truly laughed, at something foolish she had said over breakfast, and how the sound had surprised them both. Perhaps none of it had meant to him what it had meant to her. Perhaps she had built a marriage in her own mind that had never existed anywhere else. Downstairs, Nathaniel remained in the study long after she had gone, staring at the fire that had not yet been lit, feeling a strange hollowness in his chest that he refused to name. He told himself this was the right decision. Their marriage had been arranged by dying fathers eager to secure their family lines, two young people given no choice in the matter, bound together by contracts rather than affection. He had told himself this so many times over the past year that he almost believed it now. But her face, when he had delivered the news, had not shown him what he expected. He had braced for anger, for tears, for accusations. Instead, she had simply grown quiet, her composure so complete it unsettled him more than any outburst could have. He thought of the years behind them, the small kindnesses he had allowed himself to forget on purpose, because remembering them made the ending harder to justify. He poured himself a drink he did not want and stared into the empty glass, wondering why a decision that should have felt like relief instead felt like something breaking quietly in his chest, somewhere he had not expected to still feel anything at all. Outside, the gray afternoon deepened into evening, and within the walls of the great house, two people who had once shared a life now sat in separate rooms, each carrying a secret the other did not know, each convinced they were protecting the other by staying silent. Eleanor pressed her hand against the small, still-hidden curve of her stomach and made herself a promise. She would not beg. She would not trap him. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every difficult year of this marriage. Nathaniel, in his study, set down his glass and reached for the folder of papers his solicitor had prepared, the papers that would end everything, and told himself this was for the best, even as some small, buried part of him whispered that he was making a terrible mistake. Neither of them slept well that night. In separate wings of the same house, under the same roof, they lay awake with their own private griefs, unaware that the child growing quietly within Eleanor would soon change everything neither of them could yet imagine. Morning sickness struck Eleanor without warning, doubling her over the basin in her chamber before the sun had fully risen. Margaret held back her hair and pressed a cool cloth to her neck, murmuring soft reassurances while footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Eleanor froze at the sound, praying it would pass her door. It did, fading toward the stairs, and she released a breath she had not realized she was holding. "This cannot continue in silence, my lady," Margaret said, wringing out the cloth. "Sooner or later, someone will notice. The cook has already commented on your appetite. The housekeeper remarked how pale you have grown." "Let them remark," Eleanor said, rising unsteadily to her feet. "I will manage it a while longer." She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a gown with a higher waistline, one that skimmed loosely over her still small stomach. In the mirror, she studied her reflection, searching for signs a stranger might notice, relieved to find none obvious yet. She had perhaps 2 months, Margaret guessed, before concealment became impossible. 2 months to decide what she would do, where she would go, how she would raise a child alone in a world that offered little kindness to women in her position, even duchesses. Downstairs, the house moved through its usual rhythms, though an unfamiliar tension hummed beneath every polite exchange. The servants had begun to whisper, as servants always did, sensing the shift between their master and mistress even without being told directly. Nathaniel had taken to eating breakfast alone in his study, a stack of legal papers beside his plate, while Eleanor took her meals in the smaller morning room, telling herself she preferred the solitude. She thought often, in those quiet mornings, of how their marriage had begun. Two families united by land and old friendship, a match arranged before either of them had finished growing into adulthood. She remembered her wedding day with strange clarity, how Nathaniel had looked almost as nervous as she felt, how his hand had trembled slightly when he placed the ring upon her finger. She remembered thinking, foolishly perhaps, that something real might grow between them despite the arrangement's cold beginning. For a while, something had. She recalled evenings in the library, when he read aloud from novels he claimed to find tedious, though he always seemed to choose the ones with the most romance in them. She recalled the winter he taught her to skate on the frozen pond behind the house, laughing when she fell, catching her before she hit the ice a second time. She recalled the year her father grew ill, how Nathaniel had sat beside her through the worst nights, saying nothing, simply present, simply there. Then his own father had died, and something in him had changed. He grew distant, burdened by the weight of the title and the estate's mounting responsibilities. He spent more time in London, less time at home, and the warmth between them had cooled into something closer to polite strangers sharing a house. She had told herself it was grief, that time would soften him again. She had been wrong. A knock at the morning room door pulled her from her thoughts. Margaret entered, closing the door softly behind her. "The Duke has instructed the steward to begin an inventory of the estate's assets," she said quietly. "For the settlement, I believe." Eleanor's hands tightened around her teacup. "Then it is truly happening. You still have not told him." "I will not." Margaret sat beside her, lowering her voice further. "My lady, forgive my boldness, but this is not only about you and the Duke any longer. There is a child to consider, an heir to the dukedom, whether he wishes to acknowledge it or not. Do you truly intend to raise the future Duke of Wexford in secret, without his father's knowledge?" The words struck harder than Eleanor expected. She had thought of her own pride, her own fear of being seen as a woman clinging to a man who no longer wanted her. She had thought less carefully of what her silence might mean for the child growing inside her, a child who would one day ask questions she might not have comfortable answers for. "I need more time," she said finally, "time to understand what I truly wish to do, before I hand him a reason to stay that has nothing to do with wanting me." Margaret said nothing further, though her expression made clear she disagreed. She had served this family long enough to understand pride, and long enough to recognize when pride became something closer to self-destruction. That afternoon, Eleanor walked the garden paths alone, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the autumn chill, her hand resting absently against her stomach as she walked. She had always found peace among the roses, even in their winter dormancy, the bare branches promising a bloom that felt impossibly distant in the cold months. She thought of the child who would come in spring, when the garden bloomed again, and wondered what kind of world she would be bringing them into. She did not notice Nathaniel watching from his study window, until she glanced up and found his eyes upon her. He did not look away immediately, and for a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the distance of the garden and the glass. Two people who had once shared everything, now separated by silence and pride, and secrets neither fully understood in the other. Then he turned from the window, and she continued her walk, her heart heavier than before. That evening, an unexpected guest arrived. Dr. Alan Whitfield, the family physician, had been summoned weeks earlier to examine one of the older servants suffering from a persistent cough, and his visit had finally arrived after several delays. Eleanor had nearly forgotten the appointment entirely, and the sight of his carriage in the drive sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Dr. Whitfield had attended her own examinations in the early weeks of her pregnancy, sworn to secrecy alongside Margaret, and she prayed he would remain discreet enough not to raise suspicion during this visit. She kept to her chamber through most of his examination of the servant, emerging only when she heard his carriage preparing to depart. In the entrance hall, she nearly collided with Nathaniel, who had come to see the doctor off with the usual courtesy expected of a host. "Your Grace," Dr. Whitfield said, bowing slightly to them both, his eyes flickering briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Eleanor. "A pleasure, as always." "Thank you for attending to Agnes so promptly," Nathaniel said. "I trust her recovery will be swift." "With rest, certainly." The doctor's gaze lingered a moment longer on Eleanor than politeness strictly required, and she felt her pulse quicken, terrified he might say something careless, some slip of professional habit that could unravel everything. But he only nodded once more and took his leave, climbing into his carriage without another word. Nathaniel watched the carriage roll away before turning to Eleanor, studying her face with an expression she could not quite read. "You seem unwell yourself of late," he said, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "Perhaps Dr. Whitfield should examine you as well, before he departs entirely from the county." Panic flared bright and sudden in her chest. I am simply tired, Nathaniel. The autumn air does not agree with me this year. He studied her a moment longer, something almost like concern flickering across his features before he masked it again with cool detachment. As you wish, he said, and turned back toward his study, leaving her standing alone in the entrance hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the banister for support, and did not release her held breath until she reached the safety of her own chamber. Margaret found her sitting on the edge of her bed, pale and trembling, and rushed to her side. He almost realized, Eleanor whispered. He noticed how tired I look, how little I eat. It will not be long before he understands, Margaret. I do not know how much longer I can hide this. Then perhaps, Margaret said gently, it is time to stop hiding it. Eleanor said nothing, staring at her own hands folded in her lap, torn between the pride that had guided every decision since Nathaniel's return, and a growing fear that her pride might cost her more than she was prepared to lose. Outside, the autumn wind rattled against the window panes, and somewhere below, in his study, Nathaniel sat with the settlement papers spread before him, unable to focus on the words, his mind circling back again and again to the pale, tired look in his wife's eyes that he could not quite explain away. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with the crest of the Winslow family, requesting the presence of the Duke and Duchess of Wexford at an autumn gathering the following week. Eleanor stared at the card for a long moment before setting it aside, dreading the thought of appearing in public while her secret grew harder to conceal with each passing day. She was nearly 4 months along now, and though her gown still hid the evidence well enough, she feared the sharp eyes of society women who made a sport of noticing such things. We cannot decline, Nathaniel said when she raised the matter over a rare shared dinner, one of the few meals they had taken together since his return. Lady Winslow would take it as an insult, and given the delicacy of our current situation, I would rather not invite further scrutiny into our affairs. Our current situation, as you call it, is already the subject of enough scrutiny, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level. Half the county already suspects something is amiss between us. All the more reason to appear united at Lady Winslow's gathering. Whatever happens between us privately, Eleanor, I have no wish to become the subject of gossip in every drawing room in the county. She almost laughed at the irony of his words, that he wished to protect their reputation even as he prepared to dissolve their marriage entirely. But she said nothing further, only nodded her agreement and turned back to her plate, appetite gone despite the hunger that had plagued her most days since the pregnancy began. The evening of the gathering arrived too quickly. Eleanor stood before her mirror as Margaret laced her into a gown carefully chosen for its forgiving cut. The deep blue fabric gathered high beneath the bust in a style fashionable enough not to draw comment, practical enough to conceal what needed concealing for a few hours longer. You look lovely, my lady, Margaret said, adjusting a final pin in her hair. No one will suspect a thing. Eleanor studied her reflection, searching for the confidence Margaret's words implied, and finding only exhaustion staring back at her. She pressed a hand briefly to her stomach, feeling the faint, still new flutter of movement that had begun just that week, a sensation so strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once that she had wept the first time she felt it, alone in her chamber, wishing desperately she had someone to share the moment with. The Winslow estate glittered with candlelight when their carriage arrived, music drifting from the open windows, laughter and conversation spilling into the cool evening air. Nathaniel offered his arm as they climbed the front steps, a gesture of pure habit rather than affection, and Eleanor took it because refusing would have drawn more attention than accepting. Inside, the gathering swirled around them, familiar faces offering polite greetings, curious glances lingering a moment too long on the space between husband and wife. Eleanor smiled through it all, exchanging pleasantries she barely registered, her mind occupied with the constant, exhausting effort of standing tall and appearing well despite the fatigue pulling at her limbs. It was during a lull in the music, while Nathaniel had drifted toward a group of gentlemen discussing matters of trade, that Lady Beatrice Winslow found her alone near the refreshment table. The elderly woman had a reputation throughout the county for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, and Eleanor felt a flicker of unease as the dowager approached. My dear Duchess, Lady Winslow said, settling beside her with the ease of a woman long accustomed to commanding any room she entered. You look positively radiant this evening, though I confess you also look rather tired around the eyes. Are you sleeping well? Well enough, Lady Winslow. The autumn air always leaves me somewhat fatigued. The older woman studied her for a long moment, her gaze traveling with deliberate slowness from Eleanor's face down to the careful drape of her gown, and something in her expression sharpened with sudden understanding. How long have you known? She asked quietly, her voice dropping low enough that no one nearby could overhear. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "I do not understand your meaning. My dear girl, I have borne 5 children and buried 2 husbands. I know the particular exhaustion of early motherhood when I see it, and I saw it the moment you walked through that door." Lady Winslow's expression softened unexpectedly, losing its usual sharp edge. "Does the Duke know?" Eleanor's throat tightened, tears threatening despite her best efforts to hold them back. "No," she whispered, "and I beg you, Lady Winslow, do not speak of this to anyone, please. Why ever not? Surely this changes everything between you. I have heard the rumors of your impending separation, child. Surely a coming heir would end such foolishness at once." "I will not use this baby to trap him into staying," Eleanor said, the words coming out fiercer than she intended. "If he wishes to leave a marriage of obligation, I refuse to replace it with an obligation of a different kind." Lady Winslow regarded her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across her weathered features. "Pride is a fine thing, my dear, until it costs you everything you truly want. Believe an old woman who has watched pride ruin more marriages than infidelity ever did. Tell him, before rumor does it for you, and believe me, rumor is already circulating. I am not the only sharp-eyed woman in this room." Eleanor glanced around the crowded ballroom with fresh alarm, noticing for the first time the way certain women's eyes lingered on her a moment too long, the way conversations seemed to pause and resume as she passed. Perhaps her secret was less secret than she had believed. She excused herself soon after, seeking the relative quiet of a side terrace overlooking the darkened gardens, needing air and space to steady her racing thoughts. She had not been alone there long when footsteps approached behind her, and she turned to find Nathaniel standing in the doorway, his expression unusually uncertain. "You disappeared rather suddenly," he said, stepping onto the terrace beside her. "Lady Winslow seemed to say something that upset you." "It was nothing," Eleanor said, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool night air. "Merely gossip, as always." He studied her in the moonlight, and for a moment, something in his careful composure seemed to crack. "Eleanor, are you well? Truly well? You have seemed unlike yourself for weeks now, and I confess, I do not know what to make of it." Her heart pounded. Here was her chance, she thought, the opening she had both longed for and dreaded in equal measure. She could tell him now, in this quiet moment away from prying eyes, could watch his face as he learned the truth that would change everything between them. But fear held her tongue. Fear that he would believe Lady Winslow's suggestion, that he would think she had deliberately withheld the truth to manipulate him into staying, to trap him with obligation, when he had made clear he wanted freedom instead. She could not bear the thought of him looking at their child, when it came, as nothing more than the chain that had bound him against his will. "I am simply tired," she said again, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "The season is difficult for me this year." Something in his eyes dimmed, whether from disappointment or simple resignation, she could not tell. "Of course," he said quietly. "Shall we return inside? I believe supper is about to be served." He offered his arm again, and she took it again, and together they walked back into the glittering light and noise of the ballroom, each carrying their own private ache, each wondering privately what the other was truly thinking, neither brave enough yet to break the silence that had grown between them like a wall neither knew how to dismantle. Later that night, after they returned home and retired to their separate chambers, Eleanor lay awake staring at the canopy above her bed, replaying Lady Winslow's words again and again. "Pride is a fine thing until it costs you everything you truly want." She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the small flutter of movement that had become her secret comfort in the loneliest hours, and wondered what she truly wanted, beneath all the pride and fear that had governed her choices these past weeks. Down the corridor, in his own chamber, Nathaniel sat by his window, unable to sleep, turning over the strange, sad look he had seen in his wife's eyes on the terrace. He thought of Lady Winslow's reputation for shrewd observation, wondered what she might have said to leave Eleanor so unsettled, and felt, for the first time in months, a genuine and unfamiliar worry for his wife's well-being that had nothing to do with duty or obligation at all. He did not yet understand the shape of his own feelings. He only knew that something had shifted within him that evening, some crack forming in the careful wall he had built around his heart since his father's death, and he found himself, against all his own expectations, unwilling to simply let her fade into a settlement and a signature on a piece of paper. Rain fell steadily against the windows the following week, trapping the household indoors and stretching the days long and quiet between them. Eleanor spent most of her hours in the small sitting room off her chamber, a space Nathaniel rarely visited, working at needlework she barely saw, her mind circling endlessly around Lady Winslow's warning, and her own stubborn silence. She had begun in recent days to feel the child move with greater strength, small ripples beneath her skin that had grown into unmistakable movements she could feel with her own palm pressed flat against her stomach. The sensation brought her equal parts joy and sorrow, joy at the small life growing within her, sorrow that she had no one beside her to share the wonder of it, no husband's hand resting alongside her own to feel their child stir for the first time. Margaret found her one afternoon sitting very still, tears sliding silently down her face, one hand pressed to her stomach. "My lady, what troubles you?" "The baby moved," Eleanor said softly, a small sad smile touching her lips despite the tears. Strongly, this time. I only wished someone else could feel it too. Margaret's expression softened with sympathy, and she knelt beside Eleanor's chair, taking her free hand gently. "You do not have to bear this alone, my lady, not unless you choose to." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I know, Margaret. I am beginning to think I have made a grave mistake in my silence." Before Margaret could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door, and Eleanor quickly wiped her face and composed herself before calling permission to enter. It was not Nathaniel, but the housekeeper, informing her that the Duke wished to speak with her in the study, whenever convenient. Eleanor's stomach twisted with fresh anxiety, wondering what new development had prompted this summons. She found him standing near the fireplace, a letter in his hand, his expression unusually troubled. "I received word from my solicitor this morning," he said without preamble. "The settlement papers are complete. They require only our signatures to finalize the separation." Eleanor's breath caught, the reality of the moment crashing over her with sudden, overwhelming weight. She had known this day approached, had told herself she was prepared for it, and yet standing here now, facing the actual documents that would end her marriage, she found herself unable to move, unable to speak. "I see," she managed finally. Nathaniel set the letter down on his desk, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "I do not require your signature today. Take whatever time you need to review the terms with your own solicitor, should you wish it. I only wanted you informed that the matter has reached its final stage." She nodded, though something in her chest felt as though it were collapsing slowly inward. "Thank you for telling me directly." He hesitated, an unusual uncertainty crossing his features. "Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever has passed between us, I never intended for you to suffer for the failures of this arrangement. You deserve better than what our families forced upon us both. Do you truly believe it was only obligation between us, Nathaniel? Nothing more?" The question left her before she could stop it, raw and unguarded in a way she had not allowed herself to be in months. He studied her for a long moment, something flickering behind his careful composure. "I believed, for a time, that something more might grow between us. I was perhaps naive to hope for it, given how our marriage began. And now? Do you still hope for it?" He looked away, toward the window and the gray rain beyond it, unable or unwilling to answer her directly. "It no longer matters what I hope for, Eleanor. The papers are drawn. The decision has been made." She left the study without another word, her heart aching with a grief she could not fully name, wondering if the moment she had just witnessed was the closest either of them would ever come to admitting what still lingered between them, buried beneath months of distance and pride and unspoken fear. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Margaret arrived with unexpected news. "My lady, I overheard Mrs. Bell speaking with one of the kitchen maids. There is talk among the staff, whispers about your condition. I fear the secret is not as well kept as we believed." Panic flared bright in Eleanor's chest. "What exactly did they say?" "Only speculation so far, but it will not remain speculation for long, my lady. Someone will eventually say something to the Duke directly, or he will notice for himself. Better he hears the truth from you than from a servant's careless whisper." Eleanor sank onto the edge of her bed, exhaustion and fear warring within her. She thought of Lady Winslow's words at the gathering, of Nathaniel's unexpected vulnerability in the study that very afternoon, of the settlement papers waiting on his desk for her signature. Everything was converging toward a moment she could no longer avoid. "Tomorrow," she said finally, more to herself than to Margaret. "I will tell him tomorrow." But the following morning brought fresh complications. Nathaniel departed before dawn for an urgent matter concerning a tenant dispute on the estate's northern border, a matter that required his personal attention, and kept him away from the house for the entire day. Eleanor waited anxiously through the long hours, rehearsing the words she would say when he returned, only to receive word by messenger that he would not return until the following evening, having decided to stay overnight at the Northern Lodge to oversee the dispute's resolution personally. She spent the day in restless anticipation, her carefully rehearsed confession growing more tangled and uncertain with each passing hour of delay. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered down to the study, drawn by some impulse she could not fully explain, and found herself standing before his desk, staring at the settlement papers still resting where he had left them. She picked up the document with trembling hands, scanning the formal legal language that would end her marriage, searching for some clue to his true feelings buried within the cold, practical clauses. She found nothing but careful provisions for her financial security, generous terms that spoke of a man determined to be fair even as he ended everything between them. Tears blurred her vision as she set the papers down, and it was in that vulnerable moment, alone in his study in the middle of the night, that she felt a sudden sharp cramping low in her stomach, different from the child's usual gentle movements, sharp enough to make her gasp and grip the edge of the desk for support. The pain passed after a moment, leaving her shaken and afraid, and she made her way back to her chamber as quickly as she could manage, Margaret rushing to her side the moment she saw her mistress's pale, frightened face. "It has passed now," Eleanor said, though her hands still trembled. "Perhaps only strain, from standing too long. But Margaret, I have never been more certain of anything. I must tell him the truth the moment he returns. I cannot continue carrying this secret alone, not with so much at stake." Margaret helped her into bed, tucking blankets around her with gentle care. "Then rest now, my lady. Tomorrow, when he returns, you will finally set this burden down." Eleanor lay awake long after Margaret extinguished the candles, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, praying the child within her remained safe and strong, praying she would find the courage tomorrow that had eluded her through so many missed opportunities before. Outside, the rain continued its steady fall against the windows, and somewhere to the north, Nathaniel lay awake in an unfamiliar bed, his thoughts circling back again and again to his wife's pale, tired face, wondering, though he could not yet name why, if he was making the greatest mistake of his life. Nathaniel returned from the northern lodge later than expected, delayed by a broken carriage wheel that cost him nearly 2 hours on the muddy road home. By the time he arrived, dusk had settled over the estate, and he entered through the side door near the stables, weary and mud-spattered, intending only to change his clothes, before seeking Eleanor to discuss the tenant matter he had resolved. He found his steward, Peter Grant, waiting near the study with an unusually grave expression. "Your Grace, might I have a word before you retire?" Nathaniel paused, sensing something amiss in the older man's careful tone. "Of course, Grant. What troubles you?" Grant hesitated, glancing briefly toward the closed study door as though wary of being overheard. "It concerns Dr. Whitfield's visit last week, Your Grace. I happened to overhear a portion of conversation between the doctor and Mrs. Bell regarding a prior appointment, one that predates his visit to attend to Agnes." "Speak plainly, Grant." Dr. Whitfield mentioned, quite by accident I believe, an earlier examination he conducted some weeks ago. For the Duchess, Grant's discomfort was plain, a man clearly uneasy carrying tales about his mistress, but equally certain his master needed to know. Mrs. Bell seemed to already understand the nature of the visit, Your Grace. I did not, until the doctor's words made the matter rather difficult to misunderstand. Nathaniel's whole body went still. "What are you suggesting, Grant?" "I believe, Your Grace, that her Grace may be with child." The word struck Nathaniel like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs entirely. He stood frozen for a long moment, his mind racing backward through the past weeks, through Eleanor's pale exhaustion, her strange fainting spell in the corridor, her guarded avoidance of any physical examination during Dr. Whitfield's visit, the strange, sad look on the terrace at Lady Winslow's gathering. Every piece he had failed to properly assemble suddenly clicked into terrible, undeniable place. "Thank you, Grant," he managed finally, his voice unsteady. "You were right to inform me." He dismissed his steward and stood alone in the corridor for several minutes, gathering himself before climbing the stairs toward Eleanor's chamber, his heart pounding with an emotion he could not fully name, something tangled between fury and fear and a desperate, aching hope he did not yet dare examine too closely. He knocked once, sharply, and entered without waiting for permission, finding Eleanor seated by her window, Margaret beside her arranging her hair for the evening. Both women startled at his sudden entrance, and Margaret rose quickly, curtsying before slipping from the room at a small gesture from her mistress, sensing immediately the gravity of the moment unfolding. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said, rising from her seat, her face draining of color at his stormy expression, "you have returned earlier than expected. I need you to tell me the truth, Eleanor, right now, without evasion." His voice shook slightly, betraying the careful control he was struggling to maintain. "Are you carrying my child?" The question hung in the air between them, And Eleanor felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses crumble entirely. There was no more room for delay, no more opportunity for careful timing or gentle preparation. The truth stood before her, demanded by the very man she had spent weeks protecting from it. "Yes," she whispered finally, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Nathaniel, I am carrying your child." He sank into the nearest chair as though his legs could no longer support him, his hands covering his face for a long, silent moment. When he looked up again, his eyes were bright with an emotion she could not fully identify, something raw and unguarded that she had not seen in him since the earliest days of their marriage. "How long have you known?" "Since before you returned from London." "Nearly 4 months now." 4 months. His voice cracked slightly on the words. 4 months, and you said nothing. Even when I told you I intended to end our marriage, you said nothing. Even when I asked you directly if you were unwell, you looked me in the eye and lied to me, Eleanor. What would you have had me do? Her own voice rose now, months of suppressed fear and hurt finally breaking free. Tell you the very day you arrived home to inform me our marriage was over? Trap you with a child the moment you tried to walk away from me? I would not do that to you, Nathaniel. I refuse to become one more obligation forced upon you against your will. You thought I would believe you were trapping me. He rose from the chair, crossing the room toward her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like anguish. Eleanor, I have spent 4 months signing papers to end a marriage I convinced myself neither of us truly wanted, while you carried our child in silence, alone, afraid to tell me the truth because you believed I would think so little of you. What was I meant to believe, Nathaniel? You told me yourself there was never affection between us, only obligation. You told me our marriage was an arrangement forced upon us by dying fathers, nothing more. How was I to know a child would change any of that, rather than simply becoming one more chain you resented? The accusation hung between them, raw and painful, and Nathaniel felt the full weight of his own words from weeks earlier crashing back upon him, understanding now with terrible clarity how thoroughly he had wounded her, how completely he had convinced her that nothing genuine had ever existed between them. I was wrong, he said quietly, the fight suddenly draining from his voice. Eleanor, I was wrong about everything I told you that day. I convinced myself there was only obligation between us, because it was easier than admitting how much losing you would hurt me. I told myself I was releasing you from a marriage you did not want, because I could not bear the alternative, that perhaps you simply did not want me. Eleanor stared at him, stunned by the sudden vulnerability in his voice, so different from the cold, controlled man who had walked through her door weeks earlier to end their marriage. You believed I did not want you? You grew so distant after my father's death, so quiet, so withdrawn. I told myself you were relieved by the distance growing between us, that perhaps you had always resented the arrangement our families forced upon you, and I was simply too proud to ask you directly what you truly felt. I grew distant because you grew distant first, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. I did not know how to reach you after your father died, Nathaniel. You buried yourself in London, in business, in anything that kept you away from home, away from me. I thought you were pulling away because you regretted our marriage entirely. They stood staring at each other across the small distance of the chamber, months of misunderstanding and pride and unspoken grief finally laid bare between them, two people who had each convinced themselves of the other's indifference while quietly, privately, aching for exactly the opposite to be true. The papers, Nathaniel said finally, his voice hoarse. The settlement. Eleanor, I do not want to sign them. I never truly wanted to sign them, if I am honest with myself. I told myself I was doing the honorable thing, releasing you from a marriage that brought you no happiness. But the truth is, I was terrified of admitting how much I still cared for you, how much I feared you no longer cared for me in return. Eleanor pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the child move gently beneath her palm, and found herself crossing the remaining distance between them, closer than they had stood together in months. I never stopped caring for you, Nathaniel, not for one single day, even when you told me you wished to end our marriage. I simply did not know how to tell you, how to reach past the distance that had grown between us. He reached for her hand, hesitant at first, as though unsure of his welcome, and when she did not pull away, he pressed her palm against his chest, over the frantic beating of his own heart. I am so sorry, Eleanor, for all of it. For the words I said, for the papers I nearly signed, for every month I let my own fear keep me from asking you the truth directly. Tears streamed freely down her face now, though they felt entirely different from the tears she had cried alone in her chamber these past weeks, lighter somehow, touched with something that felt dangerously close to hope. What happens now? He raised his other hand slowly, hesitantly, until it rested gently against her stomach beside her own. And the moment his palm made contact, the child shifted beneath his touch, a small, definite movement that made his breath catch audibly in his throat. "Now," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I burn every single one of those papers, and I spend whatever time remains to us, proving to you, every single day, that you were never merely an obligation to me, Eleanor, that you were, that you are, the truest thing in my entire life." Nathaniel carried the settlement papers to the fireplace himself that very night, feeding each page into the flames one by one, while Eleanor watched from the chair beside the hearth, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach. Neither of them spoke as the fire consumed the careful legal language that had nearly ended their marriage, the orange light flickering across both their faces. And when the final page curled into ash, Nathaniel turned to her with an expression she had not seen since the earliest, happiest days of their marriage. "I have wasted so much time," he said, kneeling before her chair and taking both her hands in his, "months of pride and fear, when I could have simply asked you the truth instead of assuming the worst. I do not wish to waste another single day, Eleanor." "Nor do I," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, in a gesture so achingly familiar it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "But Nathaniel, we cannot simply pretend the past months did not happen. There is still much we must speak of, much we must understand about each other, if we hope to build something stronger than what nearly broke between us." He nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words even as his heart ached to simply move forward without dwelling on the pain behind them. "Then let us begin tonight. Tell me everything, Eleanor. Every fear, every doubt, every moment these past months when you needed me, and I was not there for you." They talked long into the night, seated together before the dying fire, unraveling months of misunderstanding one careful thread at a time. Eleanor spoke of the loneliness she had felt after his father's death, the way his growing distance had convinced her their marriage had always been merely an arrangement to him, nothing more. Nathaniel spoke of his own grief, buried so deep he had not recognized how thoroughly it had reshaped him, how his fear of losing another person he loved had driven him to push her away before she could choose to leave him first. "I convinced myself ending things cleanly would hurt less than watching you grow to resent me," he admitted, staring into the last embers of the fire. "I was a coward, Eleanor. It was easier to end the marriage myself than to risk you ending it eventually, on your own terms. And I convinced myself my silence protected you," she replied, "when really, it only protected my own pride. I feared you seeing me as a woman desperate to trap you, when the truth is, I simply loved you too much to risk hearing you say the child meant nothing to your decision." They sat with that admission between them, the word love finally spoken aloud after months of careful avoidance, and something eased in both their chests at the simple honesty of it. In the weeks that followed, the household noticed the change immediately. The Duke and Duchess took their meals together again, walked the garden paths side by side each morning, and the cold formality that had governed the house for months gradually melted into something warmer, gentler, filled with quiet laughter that had been absent far too long. Nathaniel insisted Eleanor rest properly, hovering with an attentiveness that occasionally exasperated her, though she found herself secretly treasuring every small fussing gesture, every reminder that he was truly, finally, present in their life together. Word of the coming heir spread quickly through the county once Nathaniel made the announcement official, and congratulations poured in from every corner, including a particularly satisfied letter from Lady Winslow, who claimed full credit for having personally set matters right between them, an assertion Eleanor found more amusing than accurate, though she wrote back a warm letter of thanks regardless. Dr. Whitfield became a regular visitor in the following months, monitoring both mother and child with careful attention, declaring Eleanor's health strong despite the earlier strain of her hidden pregnancy. Margaret remained a constant, comforting presence throughout, though she allowed herself small, satisfied smiles whenever she witnessed the Duke's growing devotion to his wife, having watched the entire painful unraveling and healing between them from its very beginning. As winter deepened and the garden Eleanor loved slept beneath its blanket of frost, she found herself increasingly restless with anticipation, counting down the weeks until spring would bring both new blooms and a new life into their household. Nathaniel read to her each evening now, not from novels chosen carelessly but from books they selected together, his voice a steady, comforting presence as her body grew heavier with the child they both now eagerly awaited. One quiet evening in late winter, as they sat together before the study fire that had once witnessed such painful conversation between them, Nathaniel took her hand and pressed it gently to his lips. "I have been thinking," he said, "of all the years ahead of us, of watching our child grow, of the family we might build together, if you will still have me after everything I put you through. I never stopped wanting you, Nathaniel, Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. Not for one single day, even in our darkest weeks. Then let me ask you properly, he said, surprising her by lowering himself carefully to one knee beside her chair, despite having been married to her for years already. Eleanor, will you choose me again? Not because our families arranged it, not because duty demands it, but simply because you wish to spend your life beside me? Tears filled her eyes as she cupped his face in both hands, leaning down to press her forehead against his. I choose you, Nathaniel. I have always chosen you, even when I was too afraid to say so aloud. He rose and gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of the precious weight she now carried, and held her close before the fire while outside. The first gentle snow of the season began to fall silently over the sleeping garden, promising the spring bloom that would soon arrive alongside their child, a new beginning built not on obligation or arrangement, but finally, truly, on the love that had quietly endured beneath all their fear and pride, waiting patiently for both of them to find the courage to claim it. Spring arrived early that year, coaxing the first green shoots through soil that had lain frozen for months, and with it came the labor pains that seized Eleanor without warning one gray morning while Nathaniel was reviewing accounts in his study. Margaret's frantic knock brought him running before she had even finished her sentence, and he took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding with a fear more intense than anything he had felt during the darkest weeks of their separation. Send for Dr. Whitfield immediately, he ordered, already moving toward Eleanor's chamber, where her cries of pain reached him even through the closed door. Inside, he found her gripping the bedpost, her face pale and damp with effort, and the sight of her suffering nearly buckled his knees beneath him. Nathaniel, she gasped, reaching for him as another contraction gripped her body. It is happening faster than we expected. He crossed the room instantly, taking her hand and pressing his lips to her knuckles, refusing to be moved from her side, despite the housekeeper's gentle suggestion that such matters were typically handled by women alone. I am not leaving you, Eleanor, not for anything. Dr. Whitfield arrived within the hour, quickly assessing that the birth was progressing rapidly but without complication, a small mercy that eased some of Nathaniel's terror even as he watched his wife labor through hours of exhausting pain. He remained beside her throughout, murmuring encouragement, wiping her brow, absorbing every gripping squeeze of her hand without complaint, understanding in some deep, wordless way that his presence mattered more than any words he might offer. As afternoon light faded into evening, the chamber filled suddenly with a new, small cry, sharp and furious and utterly beautiful, and Nathaniel felt tears spring unbidden to his eyes as Dr. Whitfield placed a tiny, red-faced infant into Eleanor's exhausted, waiting arms. A son, the doctor announced, his own voice thick with emotion despite years of attending such moments. Strong and healthy, Your Grace. Eleanor gazed down at the tiny face, already memorizing every small detail, the dark wisps of hair, the furious scrunched expression that would soon relax into curious wonder at the world around him. Nathaniel, she whispered, come meet our son. He moved to her side immediately, gazing down at the child who represented every fear and hope of the past year, the secret she had carried alone, the truth that had finally brought them back together after months of painful distance. He reached out with trembling fingers to touch the baby's impossibly small hand, and the infant's fingers curled instinctively around his own, gripping tight. He is perfect, Nathaniel said, his voice breaking entirely on the words. Eleanor, he is absolutely perfect. They named him Edward, after Nathaniel's grandfather, a man remembered fondly throughout the county for his fairness and warmth, qualities Nathaniel hoped his own son might inherit, alongside the title he would one day carry. The household celebrated the arrival of the young heir with genuine joy, the staff who had witnessed months of painful tension between their master and mistress, now witnessing instead the beginning of something new and hopeful. In the weeks that followed Edward's birth, Nathaniel proved himself endlessly devoted, spending hours simply watching his son sleep, learning the particular rhythm of his cries, insisting on holding him even during the small hours of the night, when most fathers of his station would have left such duties entirely to nurses and servants. Eleanor watched this transformation with quiet wonder, recognizing in her husband's devotion the same tender warmth she had glimpsed in their earliest years together, now fully returned and multiplied by the presence of their child. You have become quite the doting father, she teased one evening, finding him rocking Edward gently before the nursery fire, humming some tuneless melody beneath his breath. I intend to make up for every month I was absent, he said, glancing up at her with a soft smile. Not only to you, Eleanor, but to him as well. He will never doubt, Not for a single day of his life, how deeply he is loved. Word of the healthy heir spread quickly through society, and visitors began arriving to offer their congratulations in person, including Lady Winslow, who arrived with an enormous bouquet and an even larger degree of satisfaction at having played some small part in the couple's reconciliation. "I told you pride would cost you everything, my dear," she said to Eleanor, cradling baby Edward with practiced ease despite her advanced years. "I am pleased to see you took an old woman's advice, even if rather belatedly." "We are both grateful for your counsel, Lady Winslow," Nathaniel said, earning himself an approving nod from the sharp-eyed dowager, who had clearly expected considerably less grace from a duke previously determined to end his marriage entirely. As the months passed and summer warmed the estate's gardens into full bloom, Eleanor found herself reflecting often on how close they had come to losing everything, through pride and silence and fear. She thought of the woman she had been on the day Nathaniel returned to end their marriage, so certain that protecting her own dignity meant hiding her heart entirely, and marveled at how thoroughly love had proven stronger than either of their fears once given the chance to breathe freely between them. Nathaniel, for his part, had become a changed man in ways the entire county noticed and remarked upon. Gone was the cold, distant duke who had spent more time in London than at his own estate, replaced instead by a devoted husband and father who rarely left his family's side, who had learned through painful near loss exactly how much genuine happiness had been within his grasp all along, waiting only for him to set aside his pride long enough to claim it. One golden evening in late summer, they walked together through the garden Eleanor had always loved, baby Edward sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms while roses bloomed in full, riotous color around them. Nathaniel paused beside the very bench where he had once watched her walking alone, heavy with secrets and grief, and pulled her gently close, resting his chin atop her head as they both gazed down at their sleeping son. "I used to believe duty and love could never truly coexist," he murmured, "that a marriage born from arrangement could offer nothing more than obligation. I was wrong about so much, Eleanor, but never more wrong than that." "We built something real from an arrangement neither of us chose," Eleanor replied softly, leaning into his embrace. "Perhaps that makes what we found together even more precious, Nathaniel. We did not simply inherit this love. We fought for it, nearly lost it, and found our way back to it regardless." He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, then to the soft crown of their sleeping son's head, and the three of them stood together in the fading golden light, a family finally whole, built not on the cold foundations of duty and obligation that had once defined their beginning, but on the hard-won, deeply rooted love that had carried them through their darkest season and into this quiet, blooming peace they now shared together, certain at last of everything that truly mattered between them.